Welcome to Lecture 7 of PS201 Seven-Step Problem Solving. This lecture covers Step 6 of the framework, Synthesise the findings. We have conducted the analyses, the data is in, and the ghost slides are populated. Now comes the step that separates a competent analyst from a skilled one, synthesis. Synthesis is not reporting, it is the intellectual act of converting a collection of findings into a single, coherent, actionable argument. It is the hardest step in the framework, and it is the one that most teams get wrong. Here is the course roadmap. We are 6 lectures in, with 2 remaining after today. This is the second to last substantive step. Synthesis converts analysis into recommendation, and communication delivers that recommendation to the people who can act on it. Synthesis is the pivot point, everything before it is preparation, and everything after it is delivery. The quality of the synthesis determines whether 6 weeks of analytical work produces a clear, confident recommendation or a muddled collection of findings that no one knows how to act on. There is a critical distinction that every analyst must internalize before attempting synthesis. Summary is not synthesis. Summary reports what happened, it describes the findings without interpreting them. Synthesis answers the so what? It takes the findings, weighs them against each other, and produces a judgment about their combined meaning. A summary of Northmart's analysis might read, labor costs increased 15% over 2 years. A synthesis reads, Northmart's margin deterioration is primarily driven by unmitigated labor cost inflation, and reversing it requires immediate intervention in workforce planning and shift scheduling. The so what? Question operates at 4 levels, and the movement from one level to the next requires an active judgment call. The first level is data, a raw observation with no interpretation attached. Northmart's labor cost as a percentage of revenue increased from 19% to 24% between January of last year and December. That is a data point. It is accurate, it is precise, but it tells you nothing about what to do. To move up from data, you must interpret, you must ask, is this change expected, unexpected, significant, or alarming? The second level is the finding, a data point plus an interpretation of its significance. Northmart's labor cost ratio increased 5 percentage points over 24 months. This is the single largest contributor to the 7-point margin decline. The finding adds context and relative weight. It tells the reader where this data point fits in the larger picture. But a finding is still descriptive, it describes what is true, without yet prescribing what to do. To move from finding to insight, you must identify the implication. The third level is the insight, a finding plus its strategic implication. The 5-point increase in Northmart's labor cost ratio reflects a structural misalignment between headcount planning and actual trading patterns, particularly in the 3 highest cost stores, which cannot be resolved through incremental efficiency measures. The insight names not just what happened but why it matters and what kind of response it demands. An insight is not self-evident from the data, it requires a judgment call that goes beyond what the numbers alone can tell you. The fourth level is the recommendation, the specific action that the insight implies. Northmart should conduct a zero-based review of shift scheduling at the 3 highest cost stores within the next 8 weeks, with a target of reducing labor cost as a percentage of store revenue by 2 percentage points by month 6. The recommendation is actionable, time-bound, and measurable. It tells someone precisely what to do, by when, and how the outcome will be assessed. Moving from insight to recommendation requires one further judgment, not just what the problem is, but what action will resolve it most effectively. Each rung on the data to recommendation ladder requires a deliberate judgment call, not a mechanical transformation of the previous level. Moving from data to finding requires a judgment about significance and relative weight. Moving from finding to insight requires a judgment about causality and implication. Moving from insight to recommendation requires a judgment about feasibility, priority, and expected impact. Analysts who fail to make these judgment calls, who stop at findings and present them as if they were self-explanatory, are not synthesizing. They are abdicating the intellectual responsibility that structured problem solving demands. Every strong recommendation argument is built around a governing thought, a single central claim that all other arguments support. The governing thought for Northmart might be, the path to restoring Northmart's margin from 11% to 16% lies primarily in restructuring labor deployment across the store network, not in revenue-side interventions. Every other finding in the analysis either supports this claim, qualifies it, or provides the evidence that makes it credible. An argument without a governing thought is a list of findings, and a list of findings cannot drive a decision. In most real analyses, findings will not all point in the same direction. Some data will support the governing thought, some will complicate or contradict it. The first response to a contradiction is to triangulate, check whether two or more independent sources confirm the contradictory finding. If a supplier interview contradicts the financial data on procurement costs, and a third source, a competitor benchmark, confirms the financial data rather than the interview, the financial data is the stronger evidence. Triangulation does not eliminate contradictions, but it helps you assign relative weight. Many apparent contradictions in analysis are not contradictions of fact, they are contradictions of interpretation. Two pieces of data can both be true and yet point in apparently opposite directions because they are measuring different things. Separating what the data actually shows from what an analyst has interpreted it to mean is an essential step in handling contradictions. Establish the facts first, agree that all parties accept those facts as accurate, and then have the interpretive debate. This prevents arguments about evidence from being confused with arguments about meaning. Not all data sources are equally reliable. A finding based on audited financial accounts carries more weight than a finding based on a single manager interview. A finding confirmed by 3 independent sources carries more weight than a finding supported by 1. When contradictions cannot be resolved through triangulation, weight the competing evidence by the reliability of its source. Document the weighting decision explicitly, not because it makes the analysis more comfortable, but because it creates an audit trail that allows the reasoning to be examined and challenged. When a contradiction cannot be resolved, when 2 reliable, independent sources produce genuinely incompatible findings, report the uncertainty explicitly. Do not suppress one side of the contradiction to make the recommendation cleaner. A recommendation that acknowledges a genuine uncertainty and explains how it would be resolved is more credible than one that presents a false clarity. State the contradiction, explain why it could not be resolved within the scope of the project, and specify what additional evidence would be needed to settle it. A well-synthesized argument must pass 3 tests. The first is the one-claim test. Can the governing thought be stated in a single, clear sentence without qualification? If you need 2 sentences, or a sentence with 3 subordinate clauses, the governing thought is not clean. Work on it until it can be stated simply. Northmart's margin can be restored to 16% within 12 months by restructuring labor deployment and renegotiating 2 key supplier contracts is one claim. It is specific, it is bounded, and it is testable. The second test is the support test. Does every argument in the recommendation deck directly and specifically support the governing thought? If an argument is interesting but does not directly support the central claim, it does not belong in the main argument. It may belong in an appendix or a supporting analysis, but it must not be allowed to clutter the main line of reasoning. A governing thought supported by 5 focused arguments is stronger than one supported by 12 arguments of varying relevance. The third test is the action test. Does the governing thought and the arguments that support it tell a decision-maker specifically what to do? A synthesis that concludes Northmart faces a serious cost challenge that requires attention has not passed the action test. Northmart should restructure shift scheduling at stores 1, 2, and 4, targeting a reduction in labor cost per transaction of 15% by month 6 has passed it. Synthesis that is not actionable has not completed the journey from data to recommendation, it has stopped at insight and dressed it up as a conclusion. Moving from a set of individual findings to a coherent insight is a 4-step process. The first step is to group related findings together. Look at your populated ghost slides and identify clusters, which findings are all pointing at the same underlying issue. For Northmart, findings about labor cost growth, shift scheduling inefficiency, and productivity decline all cluster around the same structural issue. Grouping them creates the basis for a single insight rather than 3 separate findings. The second step is to name the pattern that the grouped findings reveal. What is the one thing that all of these findings have in common? For the Northmart labor cluster, the pattern is headcount is not being deployed in proportion to trading demand. That naming is the insight. It goes beyond what any individual finding shows by identifying the structural condition that explains all of them. A named pattern is a significant analytical contribution. It provides the explanatory framework within which the individual findings become intelligible. The third step is to test the named pattern against counter-evidence. If the pattern is headcount is not deployed in proportion to trading demand, does any finding in the analysis contradict that? Does any store show high headcount efficiency alongside high costs? If counter-evidence exists, the pattern must be qualified or revised. If it does not, if the pattern holds across all evidence examined, it can be stated with confidence. Testing the pattern against counter-evidence is what distinguishes a hypothesis from a confirmed insight. The fourth step is to convert the confirmed pattern into an implication, the so what, that drives the recommendation. If headcount is not deployed in proportion to trading demand, the implication is that labor cost can be reduced without reducing service quality by realigning shift patterns to match trading data. That implication is the bridge between insight and recommendation. It is the reasoning step that converts an analytical observation into a prescription for action. Without this step, the analysis remains interesting but inert. The most prevalent synthesis failure is listing findings rather than synthesizing them. A deck that presents 12 findings in sequence, each described in equal detail with equal emphasis, has not synthesized anything. It has reported. The audience is left to do the synthesis work themselves, to decide which findings matter most, how they relate to each other, and what they collectively imply. Most audiences are not equipped to do that work, and even those who are will resent being asked to do it. The synthesis is the analyst's job, not the audience's. The second common failure is premature closure, forming the governing thought too early in the process and then selectively gathering evidence to support it rather than testing it rigorously. This is the confirmation bias trap. A team that decides on day 3 that the problem is labor costs will find evidence of labor cost problems everywhere they look, and will fail to notice the supplier contract issues that are equally significant. Premature closure is particularly dangerous because it produces a recommendation that appears well supported but is built on systematically biased evidence collection. Guard against it by explicitly seeking counter-evidence before finalizing the governing thought. The first takeaway, synthesis answers the so what? And summary does not. The job of synthesis is to convert a collection of findings into a single, coherent, actionable argument. That conversion requires active judgment calls at each level of the data-to-recommendation ladder: significance, implication, and prescription. A team that stops at findings has done the analysis but not the synthesis, and a recommendation deck built on unsynthesized findings will not drive a decision. The second takeaway, every strong argument flows from a single governing thought. Before building the recommendation deck, write the governing thought in one sentence. Test it against the 3 criteria: 1 claim, supported, actionable. If it fails any of the 3, revise it until it passes. The governing thought is not a summary of the findings, it is a judgment about their combined meaning. Everything else in the deck either supports that judgment or belongs in the appendix. The third takeaway, contradictions in your findings are information, not problems to be resolved by suppression. Report them explicitly, weight the competing evidence by source reliability, and acknowledge genuine uncertainty where it exists. A recommendation that is honest about its limitations is more credible than one that presents false clarity. Decision-makers who trust your analytical integrity will act on your recommendations even under uncertainty. Decision-makers who discover hidden contradictions after the fact will not trust you again. Here is the first discussion question. You have 12 findings from the Northmart analysis. 3 relate to labor cost growth, 2 to shift scheduling inefficiency, 2 to supplier contract terms, 2 to basket size decline, 1 to competitor pricing, 1 to store network configuration, and 1 to management reporting quality. Group these findings into clusters, name the pattern each cluster reveals, and write a governing thought that encompasses all of them in a single sentence. Compare your governing thought with a partner's. The second question. Your financial analysis shows that Northmart's labor cost has grown by 15% over 2 years. Your interviews with store managers suggest that the growth is driven by operational complexity introduced by a new product range. A competitor benchmark shows that Northmart's labor ratio is 12% above the peer median. But a fourth finding, a productivity analysis, shows that Northmart's transactions per labor hour are actually above the peer median at 3 of the 6 stores. How do you handle this contradiction in your synthesis? The final question. Write a governing thought for Northmart's recommendation in 1 sentence. Then apply the 3 synthesis tests. 1 claim, supported, actionable. Does your governing thought pass all 3? If not, identify which test it fails and revise it until it passes. Be prepared to read your final governing thought aloud and defend it against challenge from the group.